You're living the dream, or at least what you thought the dream was supposed to be. You've trained hard, checked all the boxes, and built the life and career you thought you wanted. But for some intangible reason, you still feel like there should be more. Dr. Richard E. Boyatzis is a distinguished university professor at Case Western Reserve University, holding appointments in the departments of organizational behavior, psychology, and cognitive science, and serving as the H.R. Harvitz Professor of Family Business. He holds a BS in Aeronautics and Astronautics from MIT and an MA and PhD in Social Psychology from Harvard. His research spans emotional intelligence, competencies, coaching, and sustained change, and he's authored more than 200 scholarly articles and multiple books, including Primal Leadership and Helping People Change. He's consulted globally, taught widely, and delivered MOOCs on leadership and emotional intelligence that have reached over 1.5 million learners worldwide. In 2024, he published The Science of Change, Discovering Sustained Desired Change from Individuals to Organizations and Communities, reflecting on decades of work on how people and systems change. His previous book, Helping People Change, Coaching with Compassion for Lifelong Learning and Growth, starts with a story about a plastic surgeon that's going to sound familiar to many of you. So I'm going to read this excerpt. It's something I don't typically do. But in reading this, I feel like it really touched on what a lot of us are feeling. So you're going to get a taste for Dr. Boyatzis' expertise in this area. So here's the excerpt. After tying off the final sutures, Greg Lakin thanked the operating room staff for another job well done. He removed his surgical mask and felt pleased that the procedure had gone well. Yet at the same time, he noticed that the joy he used to experience in his work as a plastic surgeon wasn't there. He wondered, when and how did I lose that excitement? He decided to get some help from a coach. An overachiever since childhood, Greg had attained one success after another on the road to becoming a surgeon. When he began working with a coach, he shared that this drive for success was partially fueled by the feeling that he needed to constantly prove himself. In the process, however, Greg had lost sight of his true passions and his life aspirations. For instance, he wished to have a more balanced life with time for travel and getting back to his running. He also expressed a desire to get back to South Florida, where he had grown up, so he could be closer to his family and childhood friends. Yet his current path had him working 70 to 80 hours a week, leaving little time for the other things he cared about. So now to Dr. Boyatzis, but first, a word from our sponsors. You're listening to Succeed in Medicine, the show for practicing physicians who want to master the parts of their career and life that med school never prepared us for. From interpersonal skills to career navigation to the essential information every physician needs. I'm Dr. Bradley Block, and in every episode, we bring you brass tacks advice and immediately applicable insights from world-class experts, so you can feel prepared wherever your MD takes you and build a life in medicine that's sustainable, rewarding, and actually worth all those years of sacrifice. You've spent years making careful decisions with lasting impact. When it comes to investing, the same principle applies. Lightstone Direct gives you access to institutional quality real estate investments with decades of proven experience behind them. Invest directly, no middlemen, and a $12 billion plus asset under management real estate firm in your corner. Remember, all investments involve risk. Please visit lightstonedirect.com for a full list of disclosures. Dr. Richard Boyatzis, thank you so much for being on the podcast.
Thanks for inviting me, Brad.
So let's get right into it, because they just heard me tell the story about Dr. Lakin. And, that happens to us a lot, where physicians feel like we've checked every box in training, promotion, family, like we've really hit our stride, right? And everything should be going great in our career. We've done everything we planned to do. And yet we still feel this tug. We feel unfulfilled. And so how can intentional change theory help us to reconnect with what we're looking for and maybe the meaning in our work?
Let's first look at the two factors that contribute the most to this periodic feeling of malaise or restlessness. One of the major factors is midlife crisis, which happens almost every 7 to 10 years. And it happens to all of us, where about every 7 to 10 years, we get bored with what we're doing and we're looking for something different. So if you graduate from medical school, you do your internship, your residency, and you're starting, let's say, typically around 27 or 28 in a staff physician, or you join an independent practice. Well, it's not odd that about the time you're getting close to turning 40, you're going to have been doing it for a while. You actually will have skipped the first 7-year cycle because you put so much energy into getting all the training. But by the time you get close to 40, you're starting to say, Jesus, is that all there is? I'm just going to keep taking people's kidneys out, or I'm going to keep treating families as a pediatrician, or
That's
whatever
exactly
it
what happened to
is.
me. I looked at my 2 exam rooms and I said, is this it for the next 30 years? Right?
Yeah.
Because before
Yeah.
that, every couple of years, there would be a change. College student to
Right.
med student to resident, resident to fellow if you do that. And then your first few years in practice.
And what has happened in there is at some point you become a chief of residence or a supervising physician, or if you're running your own practice. So what happens is after a while, you've done a few years of supervision and you realize that all of your medical training didn't really prepare you for dealing with people who aren't lying flat. So what ends up happening is that factor hits everybody on
Yeah.
this regular rhythm. So it's going to hit you about every 7 to 10 years. The second factor is a bit more elusive. And that is a part of my intentional change theory. I say that each of us has an ideal self, a personal vision, a sense of purpose, a dream, something we really look forward to. But we also have a sense of who we are in the real self, not in terms of what we think of ourselves, but how other people react to us. And our awareness of that is greater or lesser depending upon how reflective we are. But the real hooker here, or hook, I should say, is the ought self, that very often we get channeled according to parents, grandparents, culture, into thinking that, well, we have these skills, we should do this work. And for the most extreme is in very hierarchical cultures, India, Japan, China, Korea, et cetera, have a lot of physicians actually who are from those cultures who all of a sudden hit that 40-ish midlife crisis and realize, they've been doing this all because their parents wanted them to and expected them to, and they loved their parents and they respected them. So they did it, but their heart's not in it. So you get a combination of, did you get drawn into it with a certain degree of ought self? And then this issue of the life cycles. So what happens at that point is either you change healthcare systems and then find out in 2 years that it's not that much better. Seldom do people stop practicing. They might start a side gig, which you probably have with your podcast, among other things, but they might buy some body shops or something else.
Real estate. That's the thing. That's
Right.
That's everyone in medicine online. That's their thing. Yeah.
The problem is those are as distracting as just having affairs or learning skydiving.
A little healthier though.
Yeah, maybe more functional,
Yeah.
but nonetheless aren't satisfying that growing need.
Okay.
Because what it's doing is helping you with the wheeling and dealing, and it's helping you with your finances, your net worth, but it's not helping serve what, in my theory, and now because of my neuroimaging research and the hormonal research that doctoral students that I've been supervising have been doing, we now know that what drives sustained desired change for an individual is their vision, their dream, their sense of purpose, not goals. I mean, I even published a study in 1970 saying goals help change. And then by the late 90s, I realized I was wrong. I mean, not that I was unsure, I was wrong, because it turns out that specific goals activate the task positive network and a part of a frontal parietal control network in your brain. But once the task positive network is activated neurologically, the stress system, sympathetic nervous system is activated. And while we need stress all the time, it's very useful, it's not good for us. I mean, even mild stress causes cognitive and emotional and perceptual impairment.
Well, it sounds like the dose makes the poison, right? That's what we say about medicine and many other things, right? The dose makes the poison. It sounds like stress as well. The dose makes the poison.
That's right. But the thing that we have to be careful about is even mild doses will still contribute to a certain degree of impairment, just mild impairment. And that builds up during any day. The thing that helps people deeply continue on the process of not just enjoying life, but finding meaning in it ends up being their vision. There's a sense of purpose, core values, and they're part of that, their identity tied into that. So what ends up happening is when you hit one of these points of restlessness, if you will, technically it's liminality, you're caught in between things. If you don't have somebody helping you think through what's your dream, what's your vision now, not was 10 years ago or 15 years ago or 20 years ago when you entered medical school, what is it now? That what can happen is you can act out psychologically in the wrong areas and still not fulfill that liminality or that growing restlessness. Now, if you do, and there are a lot of people in healthcare who actually find ways to do this, then in fact, you find renewed enthusiasm. It doesn't mean you're leaving the profession. And in fact, physicians and nurses are a part of a category like professors, where, as Mike Driver said, we have spiral careers. We could stay in the same career, but the thing that makes it exciting for us is about every 7 to 10 years, we change some major aspect of what we're doing. I change the focus of my research. I change which journals I'm publishing in. I change which conferences I'm presenting at. So about every 10 years, you'll see, I mean, my entire 60-year career has been about intentional change theory and sustained desired change, but at all levels, from individual to countries. But I'll change aspects of that about every 10 years or so. And I think physicians and nurses have the same capability to do that. One of it, you might be interested in administration. So you get an MBA or something, and then you move up. Or you might be interested in medical education. You start spending more time doing some teaching at a local medical school or supervising, become a chief of residency or something like that.
So it sounds like with our careers, I guess that's one of Newton's laws, right? An object in motion. And you, as a former physicist, familiar with this, right? An object in motion tends to stay in motion unless acted on by an outside force. And so the same goes for our careers, right? We're going to keep going in the same trajectory unless we decide. And so in finding that outside force, which is going to be actually an internal force, right? We have to decide what our purpose is.
The difference from the classic physical world is that humans have this other internal system where we tend to want to feel like we matter, we have purpose, life has meaning, and we want to feel like we're contributing. If we're living in a non-totalitarian state, we very often want to be able to feel like we're working with some degree of agency. And one of the reasons many people get into healthcare is to help people.
Right. But aren't we making a difference already by seeing patients? It seems contradictory. And I know for all the physicians listening, it does make sense in their head, right? And it makes sense in my head that I don't necessarily get that feeling with a lot of my patients because I don't feel like I'm making such a big impact in their lives. When I do now, since I've been recording these podcasts that talk about these things, I notice it more when I am making a difference that I might not have noticed before. But it does still seem paradoxical that we are professional helpers.
The thing is, you get habituated to it. After you've seen X number of patients, and, in these days, you're highly regulated by having to see. I remember one of my internists who was a former student of mine telling me at the Cleveland Clinic, which is a great hospital, that an internist was supposed to have 2,800 patients, that he had 3,500 because he was very popular. But at that level, by the time you see the 8th patient of the day, you're what's called psychologically habituated to it. So you're not going to get the parasympathetic juice from helping someone if, you're treating their illness and not them and all this kind of stuff.
It's hedonic adaptation, except it's not hedonic.
Yeah. Tom Strauss, very resident leader, very effective, built up Summa Health Systems from one hospital to 9 hospitals and 7 outpatient clinics. At a certain point, because he had developed over a month period within the hospital system a very compelling vision. But a number of years later, that had drifted along and they had shifted that. So he would start and have a 60-minute meeting with the heads of each one of the hospitals or outpatient clinics once a week in his office. And what he did was brilliant. As they finished and they were leaving, he would pick two of them and he'd vary it and say, can you remember to bring back a story of a patient that is seen in your facility during the coming week? So the next week, he's got 60 minutes for his whole meeting with the top operators, and he devotes 5 to 8 minutes to having these two physician or nurses who are heads of these operating entities tell a positive story. What does it do? Everybody sitting around that room says, we're here to heal people, not just to make budgets.
Yeah.
We can have positive impact because they're positive stories. So it does what I call putting people into this positive emotional attractor state hormonally, we now know, as well as neurologically, which means that by the time you get to the financials and all the rest of the stuff, you're actually more open to learning and change.
Same reason I try to make my patients laugh.
Yes,
during the visit.
That's exactly right.
If I can make them, they're going to be more open to a change, a different diagnosis, not what they thought they had, what they really have. And they're
laughter,
be more
joy,
open.
and playfulness has been established in the medical literature as something that activates the parasympathetic nervous system, which is the only antidote to stress.
What you discussed also sounds like similar to the gratitude practice. Like the whole idea behind the gratitude practice is that you're on the lookout for things to be grateful for during the day. And it sounds like if he was doing that with his staff, then they'd be on the lookout for these positive things, which would make them more attuned to it. And then it changes their whole demeanor, even the ones who don't end up getting called on to tell their story. Yeah.
There's a double whammy here, positive whammy around why that works. First of all, gratitude, which invokes compassion, is one of these primal emotions like hope. See, the vision helps because it inspires hope. Thinking about others that have helped you or people that you are grateful to or for stimulates compassion. And those are primal emotions that put us into, again, the parasympathetic nervous system state. So at the one level, it helps the physician or the nurse feel renewed about their reason for being there. The other thing is, we now know neurologically, we're infecting people around us in 8 to 40 thousandths of a second with how we're feeling. And unless the person is on the spectrum, they're going to be picking up these emotional signals. And like I said, it's 8 to 40 thousandths of a second from Joseph Ledoux's work, very deeply unconscious. That means that it's not what you think you're showing on your face. It's how you're actually feeling inside. And the benefit of doing some gratitude or compassion work periodically during the day is that not only does it help you, but it radiates out and helps the other staff as well as the patients. And Sonia Libroski showed in these great set of studies that, if a person spent 15 minutes or 20 minutes in the morning writing in a compassion journal, a gratitude journal, that their sense of well-being skyrocketed for whether it was 16-year-olds or 30-year-olds in a steady state way, even more powerful than optimism.
If you like this podcast episode, you're going to love the other shows over at the Doctor Podcast Network. For instance, The Scalpel and Sword, hosted by Dr. Lee Nagendran Sharma, a previous guest on this show, who discussed conflict resolution. Covers topics like industrial psychology and personal development, ethics, and you guessed it, conflict resolution in healthcare. Check out Scalpel and Sword. I love that. However, we did go astray from what we were talking about at the beginning. So I do want to get back to that because, we had talked about identifying our purpose, right?
Right.
And actually, we have Jordan Grummett, who wrote a book on purpose, referred to what he called big P and little p purpose. And little p purpose was your daily activities. And then the big P purpose was what you said, a goal.
Yeah.
And so a goal, no, not a goal.
Sorry, we think of goals as SMART goals, specific, measurable. Okay. Specific goals are useful, but toward the end of a change process.
Got it.
The problem is, and this is the problem why treatment adherence is so low. 50% or less for most diseases or surgery recovery, is that physicians and nurses try to tell the patient, if you don't do these things, you're going to get worse and we're going to have to chop parts of your body off or something like that. And what happens is you're practicing what we call coaching for compliance. You're trying to tell somebody what they should do. And one of my former PhD students is on the medical school faculty at the University of British Columbia, was an MD before he started the PhD program. He showed that a patient's view, he was looking at type 2 diabetics and the impact on treatment adherence, that the patient's view of the degree of shared vision, bigger sense of purpose that they felt their physician had with them mediated the effect of all the other factors that medical research has said affects treatment adherence to help it or hurt it. So if you didn't think you and your physician had the same sense of purpose, your treatment adherence was going to be lower. But if you did feel it, your treatment adherence was higher. So I think it's that sense of purpose and meaning that's key.
Well, I want to get back to sense of purpose in terms of like what we're going to do for our careers. But since we're talking about patient care, we'll focus on this for a second and then get back to physicians and their careers. So when you're dealing with patients, right? So people are going to be motivated by hope rather than fear and this shared vision, which is really what motivational interviewing is for. It's to try and figure out their motivation. So rather than my motivation, I don't want you to have a heart attack. Their motivation might be, if I lose some weight, I'm going to be able to move more easily and play with my kids, right? And so identifying their reasons for doing something. So it really does seem like motivational interviewing and intentional change theory do have, even though they're different concepts, really have a similar foundation.
They have similar properties. Motivational interviewing, as I knew it in the 70s, was developed by a fellow named Bob Greene, and he used a lot of techniques that we had used, my research group and our research, in which we would try to get people to think of specific incidents. Now, the only thing you have to be careful of is in the application, motivational interview can drift into getting a person to think of why. And why tends to put people on a rational defensive mode. Like, why did you do this or why are you doing this? And when you do that, you're activating the task positive network again and the stress system. So you're closing down. So the part that you have to be careful of is not the why in the sense of asking for the rationale or what's your motivation here, but the why in the sense of what's the big purpose? Like, why are you even engaged in this stuff?
Well, let's use smoking cessation as an example.
Right.
So if we want to use intentional change theory to help our patient identify why they should quit smoking.
That's not going to work. It's like those of us who are volume challenged during our various parts of our lives never lose weight when you try to lose weight. So if your focus is to stop smoking, you actually won't get there. What you'll do, and I can attest to that prior to 1980, you just recidivate. And the recidivism is a high percentage. The key is, can you flip it to the healthier state? Let me use a clearer example. One of my really close friends, I don't want to mention his name because he's the big management core, it was having some neurological things that required long-term kind of care and maintenance. And at some point he'd gotten married again and had kids. And at some point he was starting to drift off of his keeping on to his physical health regime and the medicines and all that. And he's sitting with his internist and she says to him, why do you want to be healthy? And he stopped and he thought, and he said, well, I'd like to live long enough that I can see my children happily married. And she shook her head. She said, no, that's too short. She said, what about living long enough to go skiing with your grandchildren? And he said, this light went off in his head emotionally, visually, and that moment completely turned around.
But wait, that's a why. That's a why.
Yeah, it's a why, but it's not a why asking for rationale. See, she wasn't saying to him, why aren't you taking all of your meds on a regular basis? Why aren't you exercising on a regular basis? So the issue is if you ask why that pulls for a reason or a rationale, that tends to limit the person's focus. But the why on the big purpose. So I go back to the physician, the question that you ask yourself, and you should really on a regular basis, every few years. You don't have to do all this vision building stuff every year, but every 5 or 6 years, it really becomes useful. And if you are in a loving relationship, you have your partner or spouse do it about themselves, and then the two of you share it, because it's not something you do just alone.
Yeah.
But the thing you're asking yourself is, this is the key dream question. If my life were fantastic 10 to 15 years from now, what would it be like?
Yeah.
First, we're looking at whole life, not just work. And that's very important because physicians and nurses get so focused on their work that because of social identity issues, start to define their life as their work. But it isn't. You have a life.
Yeah.
So it's whole life. It's 10 to 15 years in the future, not 3 to 5, because then people forecast and plan and it goes analytic or task positive. What you're trying to do is break with reality and get people to dream. So if a person starts to say, then I would love to be able to open a shelter for rescue dogs and cats, and to be able to provide the kind of care that would increase the number of adoptions and make sure that their quality of life isn't devastating and they can make up for things. Now, it doesn't mean that in that case, a physician's going to give up their surgical practice to do it, but they might start that as a project on the side. And that side project might give them a real boost of energy.
But didn't you say earlier that sometimes what we do as physicians is when we are deciding that we're dissatisfied with our current trajectory, we'll start side gigs, and that might, but it seemed like that.
No, and what I said was sometimes the side gigs are good.
Okay.
Sometimes they're distractions. And you had talked about investing in real estate.
Yeah.
Investing in real estate is fine, but at the end of it, if that's the purpose, then what you have is greater net worth, but where's the sense of meaning?
You should hear some of these people talk about investing in apartment buildings. They are really passionate. I can't wrap my head around it, but some of them are so impassioned about it. It's pretty incredible.
One of my friends who was a real estate developer, then he and his wife, they were very devout Congregationalists. They volunteered to become a Peace Corps staff. And he was deputy director in India for 3 years. And then he was director of the Peace Corps mission in Iran before 1979. Oh. They come back after this 6-7 years in these countries, back to the Boston area. And he enrolls in a master's in education program at Harvard because he wanted to pursue something more.
The Peace Corps wasn't enough. He needed something more.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, it was something on a steady state.
Yeah.
He took his entire real estate practice and business, which by now he had involved his wife in, and they decided to build housing for refugees and women in distress. He did enough thoughtful research to realize that it's not just housing. You need to have counselors, and you need to help people who are refugees find a way to work. So he created a community system when he would build these complexes. Now, he still had a few real estate projects that were really good money-making deals, but the majority of his focus had shifted to these other things. I know physicians who decide at a certain point in their career, they're making enough money. They would like to be able to help with certain disadvantaged folks.
Yes.
Whether it's physicians, the frontiers beyond borders, or devoting a day or two a week to a local free clinic.
So what you're saying is because of that hedonic adaptation, and hedonic is probably not the right word, but that habituation that we get from seeing very similar things over and over again and feel like we're just clocking it in, finding people that are really, really in need, where we really feel like we're making material change to their lives.
Right.
But what I want to get to before we close is, you talked about purpose. How do we begin to figure out what that is? Like, where does the journey begin?
And by the way, you're right. It's a difference between a hedonic experience and a eudaimonic experience in which you feel rejuvenated. How you begin. We have a set of exercises, 19 of them we've been using since 1990 with all these longitudinal studies with people that are 25 to 65. And we had them in our 2008 workbook of Becoming a Resident Leader. But they're also in the one that focuses on coaching, where we had Greg Lakin story, helping people change. We have a bunch of them in the appendix there. So it helps to get some stimulation. So these exercises ask a person to spend time reflecting on their core values. Second, we ask this vision question and get them to dream. Third, we have a playful approach for people who feel stuck. You just won $80 million in the lottery after tax. How does your work or life change? You know enough that if you invest the 80 million in a diversified portfolio at Fidelity or Schwab, you're going to kick off $4.5 million a year.
Yeah.
That's more than paying off mortgages and setting up college funds for nephews and nieces.
And if that's not enough for you, you have to have another conversation completely unrelated.
That's right. So then there's another exercise where we put you through a transmorphic machine, and all of a sudden you have the skills and capability to do any job that exists. What would you love to do for a year or two?
Yeah.
Taking a fantasy job. So what happens is each one of these exercises, and we recommend that people do them one a day. Don't try to do multiple ones, because that way you're working your unconscious around it.
You know physicians really well.
Yeah.
We would all definitely do that. Yes.
You'd rush through it all. But anyway, and then again, talking with some others really helps, whether you're talking with professional coaches or a peer coaching group. I know there are a lot of physician study groups, if you will, or I would call them peer coaching groups, but where they get together, or physicians and nurses, they'll get together for an hour and a half lunch every other week, and they'll talk about things in their life or things at work, but it's different than just doing rounds. But those are the things that help. And sometimes people go on workshops or retreats. Like I said, various forms of coaching seem to help. Sometimes people go and get a graduate degree as a way just to jar loose the thoughts about what would ring their chimes now.
Yeah. It's funny because I have a friend and colleague who's a physician at a federally qualified health center. And he actually, just for those listeners, if you want to check out his podcast, he's been on the show before. His name is Jonathan Winkle. And I never hear him complain about these things because he's working with a population who really needs his help. And so I get the sense that he leaves every day really feeling frustrated by the system, but feeling like he really made a difference and helped because of the population that he sees.
The one thing that's important, Brad, is that it's not an all or nothing. And a lot of people who have spent decades building up practice or credibility and expertise as a certain type of physician or nurse, one of the things that ends up being very important is people can sometimes do this, like I said, as a side gig, becoming a preceptor in a medical school program. Or one of my friends who was a lifelong endodontist decided to do one day a week at the dental clinic, supervising third and fourth year dental students at Case. And he found it very rewarding. And it gave him enough of the juice that the rest of his patients were still interesting to him.
Yeah. Actually, one of my happier friends also, I don't want to misquote, he's like the head of the pediatric plastic surgery program. And because his day is divided among seeing patients, doing surgery, administrative work, research. And so there's such a variety of things that he never does develop that eudaimonic adaptation because it's so varied. And so finding these ways to, and it's not distraction, it's fulfillment. You're finding other ways to be fulfilled. And then you can bring that joy to, it's like your cup overfloweth, right? It spills over into other parts of your life.
So how can you inspire other people to live a healthier life, live a better life, if you don't feel that inspiration?
Yeah.
You can't. None of us are that good at, like Denzel Washington or Meryl Streep, to fool the people around us.
Yeah.
So what happens is, part of it is we have to pay attention to how we're managing it ourselves to be able to have a constructive and sustainable. And my theory of change, I work on sustained desired change, not just change.
Well, amazing. Well, thank you so much for taking the time, for all of the work that you do with physicians to help us to invigorate our careers. And everyone, make sure you check out The Science of Change. And Dr. Richard Boyatzis, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Brad.
Thanks for listening. I have a favor to ask. You listened to the episode until the end, which means either you fell asleep or you really liked the episode. So please write us a 5-star review, take a screenshot, and email it to me so I can send you a quick guide on how to earn patient trust in 20 seconds or less. Email me at brad@physiciansguidetodoctoring.com and feel free to suggest a topic or guest. I take your requests seriously. The views expressed on this episode are those of the interviewer and the interviewee and do not represent the views of their employer or even their significant other. Even though the magic of podcasting makes it sound like I'm talking directly to you, this is not a doctor-patient relationship, and this is not medical advice, or financial advice, or legal advice, or really any advice. Thanks again for listening. to succeed in medicine.